Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm sure it's not morning for some of you, but where I'm at, it's morning. And it's Sunday as well. And I was thinking today because recently I had released a new repository that was focused on refactoring the TD Ameritrade Library. And I thought, you know what, this is actually a good opportunity to take a look back and look at some old code that I had written originally, highlight some of the good stuff about that code, and then also highlight some of the not so good stuff about that code. Because to say I am the same coder that I was when I first started building this library is a very big stretch, even for probably the most imaginative individuals out there. And so, and again, I think it's also just good practice to take some time, reflect on some code that you write, and then saying, hey, how can you make this particular project better? How can you rethink or reimagine some of the features that maybe you wanted to incorporate or already have incorporated into a project, and really say, what could you do differently now that you have some experience under your belt and now that you've had some chance to get some feedback about a particular library. So that's what we're going to focus on in this video. We're going to spend a little bit of time of just kind of highlighting the good, the bad, and the ugly of the particular library for TD Ameritrade that I wrote. And then we're going to also explore some of the code to just reinforce some of the ideas that I talk about in the PowerPoint. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list. There is definitely some stuff I kind of skip over, but this has just been stuff that either I've heard directly from users saying, hey, this has been a pain point, or hey, I don't think we're leveraging as much as we could when it comes to using certain features and stuff like that. So let's get started. As crazy as it might seem, that library is almost 2 years old. In fact, it's going to turn 2 this month in April. I think it's April 19th is when I actually did the first commit for the TD Ameritrade Library. So a lot has obviously changed since 2 years ago, 2019, because we're in 2021. I wrote it in 2019. And again, to say I am the same type of coder I was back then is a very, very big stretch. I have learned a lot. I've used different techniques. I've tried new techniques. I've learned a lot from other libraries and all sorts of different stuff. And so that's kind of the challenge when you write code is, the first time you might write it, it's not going to come out perfectly. And then you're going to look back and say, man, I wish I would have done this differently, or man, I wish I would have changed that or incorporated this. And now that the library has gotten so popular, I think it deserves a revamp, right? It deserves an opportunity to incorporate some of the features that might have been left out. Now, when the library first came out, it did solve a lot of issues that were initially pain points for people. But as time went on, what we initially thought as being the right solution, we realized that even though it was solving a very direct problem, it wasn't being as flexible as it could be. And we'll see this specifically with the whole OAuth workflow. So while that did solve initial issues, it did also create some more pain points for people who were using the project in a very specific light. And so we're going to highlight some of that, and we'll talk just briefly about kind of what that means and really what the solution is going forward. Okay, so let's start off with the good, right? What was the good about the library? What did it initially do for people that made it where people wanted to use it? Well, the first thing was it wrapped endpoints. And so really what I mean by that is instead of you having to go out there, build the entire URL for a particular endpoint, building the payloads, ensuring that the payloads were properly formatted and all that kind of stuff, the library handled that for you. So now all you had to do was call a particular method, pass through, in some cases, a few arguments, and all of a sudden you got your data back. That made working with the TD API very easy because you didn't have to build it. You got to use that service. You just had to provide the arguments. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just take a look at the code itself so you can understand what I mean. Now, I'm going to view it with the old one first, just because it's easier and then it makes it a little bit more intuitive. Where are my samples? There's my samples. Here we go. So now what you could do is you would call just a particular method. In this case, it's called getQuotes, and you would just pass through a list of your arguments. And then by calling this, the library knows that, hey, you want to make a request to the quotes endpoint. So if I go in here and I do my, and I do get quotes, if you actually look at the underlying code, what you're going to notice here is it actually defines that endpoint. It knows what request to make, the endpoint to make it to, and the parameters that need to be passed through. So you didn't have to build any of this stuff. All you had to do was pass through a list of the symbols that you wanted to get quotes for. Well, that was easier, right? You didn't have to build a URL, you didn't have to build a payload, you just passed through arguments and you got your data back. That was a good thing. It made it easier to use the library. So that was definitely one of the first good things. I think I'm gonna leave it like this just so that way I don't have to keep like going back into it. So we'll just leave it like this. Hopefully people can read this. I'll read through some of it too. Another good thing that the library did initially was validate arguments. So sometimes when you use certain endpoints, you couldn't pass through conflicting arguments. And if you did, it would raise errors. And sometimes those errors weren't necessarily informative. They would just say, oh, the parameter you passed through wasn't good. Well, what are the possible options? Or why was it not good? The library tried to help fix that issue by giving you a list of valid arguments if it could. Or it would try to point you in the direction and say, hey, wait a minute, you passed through this argument, but then you also passed through this argument. They're conflicting, you can't do that. So the library tried making that process easier. Did it do it perfectly? No, there were definitely some issues that could be improved, and that is something I'm still looking into. But at the initial phases, I think it tried to do it as best it could, and it did do it in some regards. It would help take a list and make sure it was properly delimited so that way the API was getting the correct format of arguments. What do I mean again by that? Well, if you look into, actually get quotes is a good one, you'll notice here, prepare arguments list. What do you mean? Well, this particular private method knew to take a list and then just join everything by a comma delimited string. So this would again help prep your list. In some cases, we had arguments. Well, this little method, this private method, would take your arguments, it would know which endpoint was called, and it would make sure that the parameter you pass through, it would check that the arguments of that parameter, or sorry, the parameters of the argument. I don't know. We'll put it like this. So for example, get market hours. It has an argument called markets. These are, or I guess that's a parameter. It has a parameter called markets. These are arguments that you could pass through. It would validate these arguments to ensure that you can actually pass through the string equity for that particular argument. So it is something where it would try to help validate it. And then if something did pop up and you put in there something like, oh, I'm going to put in Dow Jones for markets, right? It would come back and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not a valid argument. You need to pass through this list of possible values. So again, it tried to help point the user in the right direction if something did go wrong. The OAuth workflow. So this is a love-hate relationship depending on who you talk to. So one of the big pain points of using the TD Ameritrade API was using the OAuth workflow. It was not intuitive and it was confusing for a lot of users. The library helped simplify that as best it could. So it basically made it where you pass through a couple arguments and then you would call a method and then it would walk you through that entire process. And then it would make it where it would save your credentials to a certain location, and it would validate your access token and refresh token. And if either one of those was expired, it took the appropriate action, whether that was going through the OAuth workflow again or just refreshing your old access token. This was actually one of the benefits initially with the library because it did make such a confusing pain point easier. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you ever wanted to go through the code, you would see this mess of silent SSO, saving the token, checking to see if the token was expired, and all this other stuff. And it gets kind of complicated. I'll be the first to say it. It does get complicated if you don't know how OAuth workflows happen and how they work. So this tried to simplify it as much as it could. The biggest pain point with this was it was never flexible as it could be. What it meant was you had to follow my protocol. Now, that was okay in the beginning because at that point, at least I was kind of solving it. However, in certain situations when people were using the library, it wasn't really flexible. And that was a problem because if it wasn't flexible, then they couldn't use that particular library the way they wanted to, or they had to go in here and change a lot of the underlying code, which became a very daunting task and also kind of intimidating one, right? Because if you start changing stuff, all this of a sudden that doesn't work, this doesn't work, and it just becomes a headache for the user. So this is definitely something I wanted to rethink and make it more flexible, but also at the end of the day, just giving people options. If you want to save your credentials to the files, we'll save it to a file. If you don't want to save it to a file, that's fine. You can use just the credentials object and you need to use it as is, where you pass it through and all that stuff. So it's trying to make it flexible for the user and saying, hey, you can decide how you want to use it, because I'm not going to assume that you're going to use the project in this particular way. I want you to be having flexibility and giving you the options of saying you could use it this way, you could use it that way. I'm not going to point you in a direction. I'm just going to give you the functionality. You can choose how to use it. Now, actually, if you look through it, you can see that really at the end of the day, it was pretty straightforward. You would just go in there, you would pass through your client ID, your redirect URI, and then your credentials location. There was a point where I was going to use Flask. I think at this point, that feature is going to go away. I am possibly looking at using a local HTTP server, so making it where I would not be asking for the URL back. It's a little bit complicated, so I'm still looking into how to make that work. If I find that it works reliably across enough users, then that feature would probably be put into the library, at least in the refactored version. If not, there would still be a manual component where you would have to provide the URL. However, you would be doing that so infrequently, it wouldn't really matter. Okay, so there's that. And then, what was the other thing? So that was definitely, in the beginning, it simplified it, but there are challenges. The next kind of good thing was it gave access to the streaming API. So the streaming API for a lot of people was pretty confusing to use because there wasn't a ton of documentation, and the documentation that was provided, it wasn't always clear. In fact, there are certain endpoints in the streaming API that are in the library that are not documented at all on the website. Things like the news endpoint, things like level 2 quotes, and things that give you access to more granular data. Even though it's not documented, the library does give you access to some of those when appropriate. Now, the streaming API, while it does give you access to it, it's still confusing. You're having to use libraries like async.io, and that makes it confusing. The only reason why is once you start getting into the whole async world, your code changes pretty dramatically. And all of a sudden, there's more considerations that you have to take. And so while it does the job, I think there is an opportunity to help simplify it / make it more robust. And so that's also something I'm going to be looking into when it comes to just rethinking, is it possible to maybe simplify this or enhance it so that way it works more reliably across a wider array of users. So this is the good. This is some of the things that the library, I think, initially did well. Doesn't mean it was done perfectly, but it did solve some major pain points in the beginning for users. The bad. Coming back to the OAuth workflow, like I said, one of the biggest challenges with the OAuth workflow is even though it did simplify it, I still had a lot of people reaching out saying it was confusing. And I did have a lot of people reach out saying, hey, it wasn't flexible and it really shouldn't be storing things here. I should want to have it stored here or there. And so at that point, that was kind of one of the initial things I said, you know what, maybe it's time to start re-looking at this library and start saying, maybe we could be doing things differently. And so one of the ways that we're going to hopefully fix this issue is we're going to introduce a new object. That new object is called the TD Credential object. And ideally, it's going to follow something that you're going to see if you use like the Microsoft Graph API, and really kind of just the Microsoft services, because they have a library in there called the Microsoft Service Authentication Library. I think it's MSAL, but I don't know the full exact name. But the one thing I liked about that particular library is they have objects in there that handle all sorts of authentication workflows. And so what you're going to find is that the new TD library has a whole file dedicated to credentials, and you're going to find that it gives you options when it comes to how you want to authenticate. You can do your authentication using the standard workflow. You could use a credential file. You can write your credentials to a file. You can take just a raw dictionary and use that as a mechanism to authenticate yourself. So again, the idea behind it is it gives you flexibility. I'm not going to point you into a certain direction. I'm not going to say you have to do the OAuth workflow. If you want to do that on your own and then you just want to provide me a dictionary, that works fine too. So it's giving people options and then making it more simplified so that way people don't run into those pain points that they had before. So that's something that was really important for me, is I wanted to make sure that was simplified for people so they're not going like, oh man, I don't know how to use this, right? It's confusing because I don't know where it's storing it, or it's, oh, my file paths aren't working. Again, I want to make it where it's easier for users in that regard. And then also too, is just giving more exposure to certain properties about your credential object. So now all of a sudden, if you want to get your refresh token, you can treat it as a property. You can get your redirect URI. You can get your client ID. And now you're going to have doc strings that give you examples on how to use these properties. So the idea behind it is it's exposing more of those properties where if you need to use that information at different points in your code, you can have it readily available through this object. So this one, I'm definitely putting a lot of time into it. So I'm not going to say it's finished yet, not even close, but it's working. But I want to make sure that we're doing it correctly and that it's really delivering on what it needs to. Alrighty, so the OAuth workflow, the love-hate relationship. Next one, organization of services. So there was an issue, and this is actually going to kind of go into the ugly, but one of the problems that I wasn't following when I first wrote this library, and it was kind of not a big mistake, but it was really an opportunity that was missed to make maintaining the code easier. In fact, I think this is probably what drove so much of the refactoring was I didn't follow this from the beginning. But there's a hierarchy with this API. There really is a natural hierarchy. Services are organized in a logical fashion, and endpoints fall under these services. And so I wasn't following that hierarchy. And because I didn't follow that hierarchy, it put a burden on that code, because now all of a sudden things weren't organized in a certain fashion. And it made maintaining the code even harder because I was basically throwing all the endpoints in a single file. Why was that so bad? Well, again, we're kind of talking about two things here, the bad and the ugly, but let me show you the client.py file and you can know right away what I'm talking about. So let's start. Okay, so we're starting at line 1. How many lines of code does this have? 2,100 lines of code. Now, mind you, some of these are doc strings, but that's a lot for a single file. And the reason it's a lot is because every single endpoint for every single service is in this particular file. That's not good. The reason it's not good is it makes it really hard to maintain. Anytime I need to modify an endpoint, I have to search for it, and then I have to make sure, okay, am I working here, or do I need to jump to this file? And it was overwhelming. And especially if somebody went in here and they didn't have a lot of experience coding, I was making it really hard for them because I was just throwing a bunch of stuff in here and I wasn't making it organized in a fashion where if somebody new was coming to use this library and they wanted to contribute, I wasn't giving them the best starting point. And so what I want to do now is say, wait a minute, there is a natural organization here that we can follow. We need to start following it. And so now what you're going to see is that things are going to be organized in a more natural hierarchy. So now you're going to see files that are dedicated to particular services. I think of a service as having multiple endpoints. So for example, market hours is a service. There has multiple endpoints that fall under it, and it returns all the same information for the most part. So now you're going to see services be their own files and their own objects, and then the endpoints that fall under those services will be the methods. The nice thing about this as well is that we're using a composition model, which basically means that when we're building our more complex objects, something that's supposed to represent market hours services, it's a combination of more simplified objects, like a session object that actually makes the request. So we're all using the same session, but we're also giving that flexibility where it's organized in a natural hierarchy. So now you would see market hours, and then you can get all market hours, or you could get market hours. That one I haven't built yet, but it's going to kind of come there. Quotes is finished, so you can do get quote, get quotes. So things are now organized in a common fashion. So how would you access all these services? Well, if you now look at the client.py file, things are organized by services. So you want to get quotes, you call the quotes method, and it will return a quotes service object. I might make these properties just to kind of, I think, follow a more appropriate dot notation, but right now they are methods. To give you an idea of what they now look like, here you go. You would log in like before. Now you're leveraging your new credential object. But now if you want to do quotes, you initialize your quote service, and look at that. You would then call it. And then just like that, you can now use each one of them. Again, documentation is key. So I want to make sure that you have usage examples, parameters, documentation, overview, and then a summary as well. So that's kind of one of the big pain points that I wanted to fix. Was it's going to make it organized in a better fashion, but it's also going to make the code more maintainable, because now if something breaks, it's easier to identify where it broke. And if something needs to be changed, you can make it and identify it quicker and then change it in a more simplified location. So that was definitely important. So organization of services. Lack of enums. So enumerations make working with constants a lot easier. We're not taking advantage of that in this library, and that was, again, something that should have been incorporated, and it wasn't incorporated as best it could. To give you an idea of that, let me just kind of show you the old code. But if you go in here, you'll notice I do have a lot of enums that were more specific to orders. But there was also an opportunity to leverage enums in certain endpoints. So for example, market hours. If you look at market hours, there's a list of constants that it follows. It can only be one of 4 options: equity, option, future, bond, or forex. I guess that's 5 options. And so this here is a great candidate for being an enum. Now, if you look at that, you're going to see that it's all organized in here. And I'm also getting away from all the uppercase stuff because I don't think that looks as pretty. I'm not sure if that's necessarily correct Python syntactically, but it looks pretty, so I'm doing it. And now each of these enums are going to be well documented. So now you're going to understand how to use all of them. So how to import them, and then how to grab that value if you need to. Now, when you're passing it through a particular endpoint, you wouldn't have the value, you would just have that. So this, again, is to make it where working with certain endpoints is easier, because you don't have to remember all the options right off the top of the head. If you do forget, you could just import the enum, and then you would have access to it just like that. So again, wasn't fully leveraged as best it could be in the original version of the library, but I think in this new version, it's going to be a lot more intuitive, and you're going to be able to leverage it a lot more. More objects. Woo! So whether it's an order, a watch list, or even potentially a quote, there needs to be more objects that make working with complex endpoints quick and seamless. So sometimes building a option chain query isn't the most intuitive, especially when you have 20 possible arguments you can pass through. And so what these objects will be designed to do is either help build those queries a little bit easier, or taking the content that is sent back from those queries and giving you a starting point to build off of. So you can take those objects, and if you want to do common calculations like, hey, I want to go through and calculate the rolling volume or something like that, you would be able to do that with these objects. To give you, again, a little bit of a sneak peek, let's take a look about some of our older objects. We'll look at the option chain. This particular object was designed to help build queries for the option chain. So that way you didn't have to remember everything off the top of your head. You could just initialize this new object, pass through some arguments, and then it would help you build those more complex queries. And then that way, if you wanted to make dynamic queries that changed based on certain inputs, you could leverage this object, update a property or two, pass through that new updated object, and all of a sudden your query would just return the data, and you wouldn't have to change as much. Again, it was leveraging that object for you. It would remove keys that didn't need to be there. It would validate inputs, so that way you didn't have to worry about them if that was the case. So that was really the intent of these types of objects, was either building the queries, or like for orders, helping you build orders. And so making sure that it was the right data types and all sorts of things like that. So that way you weren't building these complex dictionary objects and not really having any kind of structure to follow or any kind of guidance to help build those kind of complex requests. So that's something I'm looking into. I know for certain endpoints, it's already obvious. I know which ones I'm going to be doing. So orders is one, watch list are one, option chains are one. But even something like quotes, like I've been kind of thinking about, well, what if we return a quote? Should we treat that returned object, that returned dictionary as an object? What are the benefits of that? Is it something people might be interested in? Always willing to hear feedback. I'd like to hear back from some of you who watch this video. If you think it's worth it, maybe it's not worth it. If you don't see it being something that could be useful, then I think, we don't have to incorporate it, but I'd like to hear some feedback on that just because I'm kind of curious to see what people are looking for in terms of objects. I have my opinions about it, but that's, again, my opinion. That doesn't necessarily speak for everybody else. All right, so that's something we want to do, is do more objects. Oh, and I forgot to show some examples. I don't know if I have a bunch of examples, to be honest. The only one that I would say is kind of the newest one is just the credentials object. So that's an example of kind of how we're introducing a new object to help solve a common problem. And so one of them was obviously using the OAuth, but there's nothing really yet with, I would say, option chains. I think I'm still working on that one. So this is the ugly. We already talked about the client.py file, and really that's just the biggest thing with this. It's just too big. It's just way, way, way too big. It's not easy to maintain. Even the streaming one too, it's just too big. This isn't maintainable. It needs to be broken up into more logical, organized fashion. So that's definitely a pain point. Some of these files are just getting way too big and they need to be broken down a little bit more. Type hinting, it's used inconsistently. Case in point, let me see if I have it. There was one I was looking at last night and I'm going, typical Alex. I forgot to do type hinting in that one. Maybe it was watch list. Oh, I think it was watch list. Yeah, watch list. So just stuff in here where it's like, when I would ask for arguments, like I'm not using type hinting, but then in other files I was using type hinting. There's really no reason for that inconsistency. That was just, and you'll have this happen with projects. You'll start one up, you have good intentions, and then guess what? Your standards fall. And you don't follow the guidance that you really should have heeded in the beginning. And so one of it was type hinting. It was used inconsistently. So now in the new library, it's going to be used everywhere. Type hinting is definitely a benefit. I don't see it as a burden for people. Yeah, it's a little extra writing in my end, but I think it just adds value. I don't think it really takes away from it. The other thing that is, again, inconsistent is docstring. So, for example, this one looks very different than if you go into the docstrings in the main file. These ones leverage more consistent docstrings. But even stuff like just arguments, optional arguments, and all sorts of stuff, this should be reformatted and stuff like that. So docstrings were used inconsistently. In the new library, I want to use docstrings that leverage the markdown features provided in VS Code. So VS Code does allow docstrings to look quote unquote prettier. So now if you hover over them, you'll notice certain sections are more bolded or header styles or even code formatted. So if you follow these certain markdown features provided by VS Code, it makes working with docstrings a little bit easier and they just look nicer. They're easier to read for people. And I find that when they look at it, they kind of go, oh, okay, I get how this works. So these are what the new docstrings are going to look like. It's weird. I feel like there was something the other day where I said, oh, interesting. So you can see it's a method, get quote, returns a dictionary. Here's an overview. Here's a usage section. Here's get quotes. I think here's get accounts. So just making it, again, a little bit more intuitive, optional, default none. So trying to make that as clear as possible for people. And then again, just focusing on readability, because that's a big thing for me, is I want to make sure it's readability. It's docstrings, testing. Oh, God. Testing, it's disorganized. So yeah, this is not as clean as it could be. There's testing in here, but there's also samples and then personal debugging stuff that I was doing. I wasn't leveraging the launch.jsons as much as I could, and so that needs to be adjusted. So testing is now going to be just testing. Samples is going to be just samples. I'll probably have a resource folder that has some other stuff where you can see sample outputs and stuff like that. So again, this was kind of becoming messy and I didn't like that. And I want to make sure that's kind of fixed. I do like having examples of the output for certain endpoints. I think that's a good thing. I don't want to get away from, doing stuff like that just because I think for the most part, this needs to stay in here. I want to make sure people can see output and they understand what to expect back from a particular endpoint, because otherwise it gets a little confusing. Also resources as well. I want to make sure people know how to set up an account. They know how to install certain things and all that kind of fun stuff, because otherwise it gets confusing and then becomes an issue. I'll also be getting rid of the distribution and the config folders. I mean, not config folders, the distribution, the build. You don't see this on your end, but this is on my end. GitHub now has workflows that automate uploading to PyPy. So that's no longer going to be held locally on my end. That's actually going to be held through GitHub. And then again, it will help clean it up on my end where it's a little bit easier. And then also maybe adding some other workflows for doing, I don't know, just testing, automated testing. The requirements file is going to stay here. The setup.py file, README, it's going to stay here. It's really the testing, the samples, and the TD folder that are going to get the most work over. The launch.json, I'm going to have this stuff in here as well. So if people want to just leverage it, they can. And then it's just more starting content for you. All right, that's it. That's pretty much the end of the video. I just thought it was a good video where, it kind of gave an opportunity to reflect back on code that I had written earlier, saying what was good with it, what was not so good with it, and what was just plain ugly with it. Now, so that way when we're, refactoring the new library, ideally we're going to fix some of these pain points. And then, like I said, it's always good practice, especially in any time you have some old code that you're still using pretty heavily and you had written a long time ago when you weren't following maybe the best practices, to take a step back, reflect on it, and say, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here to take some of this highly used code and make it a little bit more better for that way yourself and other users. So at this point, if you have any questions about kind of just my approach, or maybe some questions about how I would maybe approach things now or why I approached things in the past, I'm all open to answering those questions, just because I know this is a coding tutorial channel. So I want to make sure if people have those questions, they can answer them. And, you really shouldn't be ashamed to ask those type of questions. Like I said, I meet some people and they're like, oh, I should have gotten it right the first time. I'm like, well, that would be nice, trust me, but that rarely is the case. Case in point here with this library, we had good intentions, but to say it was done perfectly is, again, a stretch. And I think it's important we always take a step back, look back and say, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this. All right, everybody. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next video.